Everybody. I'm Patrice Jones, and I am a co-founder of Vine Sanctuary, and I will be your MC for the evening. Before we get to the panel of the evening on ethics, I want to welcome you to the conference because this is the very first event of the Reimagining Sanctuary conference that will run from today through March. I'm psyched that you're here. And if you're watching later on video or just listening to the audio, I'm psyched for that as well. I want to say a few shout outs. She's not able to be here with us tonight, but Indra Lahiri of Indra Local Sanctuary was consulting and advising throughout the process of planning this conference, which is co-sponsored by Vine Sanctuary and Indra Local in cooperation with the Global Coalition of Farmed Animal Sanctuaries, which is a group on Facebook that you can join. I also want to give a shout out to Dr. Bronner's Magic Soap, who funds Vine's educational programs and whose pledge for this year did include some funding for this conference. And that's all. So let me introduce the topic of the evening, which is ethics. Everything about sanctuary work involves ethics in one way or another. And that's why we put this panel first, because sanctuary is an exercise in ethical decision-making in ambiguous circumstances and can be extraordinarily anguishing and challenging. First, there are so many decisions to make. Every day there's decisions to make. Some of the decisions are inherently heartbreaking and difficult, such as coming up with a euthanasia policy, coming up with an intake policy. When are you going to say yes and when are you going to say no, when maybe saying no means that someone is not going to remain alive. Other decisions are particularly complex, involving lots of different things to think about, such as the questions of safety versus freedom for sanctuary residents, such as decisions that you have to make when you're balancing competing interests. You might be balancing different interests of different sanctuary residents, or perhaps when you're thinking about whether or not to cut down a tree to create more pasture, you're balancing the interests of residents of the sanctuary against free-living animals. And there's ethical questions that aren't even self-evidently ethical, but when you really think about it, they are ethical questions, such as the question of whether or not to give tours. And if you do, how you're going to do that and what you're going to say. What are you going to say on social media or in other ways about animals in general, about particular sanctuary residents? Those are ethical decisions as well. Even the very infrastructure of your sanctuary, whether you're going to set it up to look like the farm that most humans have in mind when they think about farmed animals, or you're going to set up a habitat that's what might be more comfortable for sanctuary residents than that stereotype setup. That's also an ethical decision. Ooh, and often there's no right decision. There's no self-evidently correct decision. There's a matter of balancing different ideas. You might be balancing I wrote down here, competing goods, like this would be good and that would be good, or competing bads, or some combination of competing goods and bads. And often you're doing all of this in the context of incomplete information. You don't actually know exactly what's going to happen if you decide this or you decide that. So you'll have some gap in what you're having to do. And the other incomplete information that you have is, what do the animals want you to do on their behalf? You're making decisions on their behalf, but you can only infer, guess, use your best ethics, empathy, and imagination to try and figure out what it is they would like you to decide on their behalf. You can never perfectly, no, sometimes animals are quite clear and you know exactly what they want. I don't want to pretend, but oftentimes it's not entirely clear what someone would want you to decide on their behalf. Woo! And that's not all that makes ethics difficult, because there are so many pitfalls. When people were filling out their applications for registration, one person used the word paternalism as a potential pitfall. The treating adult animals as though you were their parent. There's the wishes that we have to be a good person, or the urge to feel like a hero. That can get in the way of ethical decision making. Then there's outside pressures from funders, from people on social media who have thoughts, from donors, and then there's our own speciesism. And I'll talk later about how that can get in the way. So, there's no way we can say everything that needs to be said in this one panel, but I think that this lineup is going to help. First, ethicist Lori Gruen is going to offer a method of thinking through ethical dilemmas. Next, Ilan Abrel will share observations from his research at numerous sanctuaries with an emphasis on this question: how can we make sure that we are respecting animal rights? And then I'll pick up that theme by offering some strategies for confronting our own speciesism. Whew. So now, let me introduce our first speaker. Lori Gruen is a professor of philosophy and a professor of feminist gender and sexuality studies at Wesleyan University, where she also coordinates the animal studies program, which she co-founded. Lori's book, Ethics and Animals, just came out in its second edition by Cambridge University Press and is absolutely the book on ethics and animals that we at Vine Sanctuary recommend. Her books, Entangled Empathy and The Ethics of Captivity, are also directly relevant to sanctuary work. You can find those recommended readings on the discussion forum for this event, which I meant to mention earlier. Please do use that, because so many people won't be able to attend live. Those are also directly relevant to sanctuary work. Lori has volunteered her time to help numerous sanctuaries think through ethical questions, and I'm so grateful that she made time to be with us today. Take it away, Lori.
Thank you so much, Patrice. I just also want to say that I'm a professor of this and a professor of that, and a professor of the other thing, but I've also been an activist and been involved in the animal movement for over 35 years. So it's not as if I'm just sitting here on my sort of chair that doesn't roll anymore. I've been in the trenches as well, and I spend a lot of time over the last 20 or so years in various sanctuaries as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Patrice did a great job just sort of identifying some of the myriad of ethical issues that come up. There's also, I think, really important ethical questions just to supplement the list that Patrice was doing about how to intervene not just in animal behavior if you're forced to do that, but also intervene with staff if you have staff, how to manage people as well as animals in the context of sanctuary work raises a whole host of ethical issues. That's both inside and outside. There's also important and interesting, and for me, quite profound questions, ethical questions that arise when making healthcare decisions, dealing with disabled animals, for example, really kind of really profound. There's also important questions that arise for sanctuary folks when thinking about research at the sanctuary. Which researchers to allow in, what should they say when they come out, how are we going to organize that kind of scholarly interactions with sanctuary work. There's another really important topic, and I'm going to sort of think through this in my general comments, and that's about the ethical issues around self-care, how to address one's own concerns about how they're feeling, and how Audre Lorde thought that self-care was warfare, and I think to a large extent the self-care industry has kind of risen up as a little bit apolitical, but ultimately self-care in the context of Sanctuary is a profound site of ethical engagement. So I did want to just mention that as another one. I think it's impossible to really talk in any kind of programmatic way about how to deal with ethical issues. So what I'm going to do instead is give you some sort of general ideas that I hope will inform your deliberations, that are going to be very unique, that are going to be very specific to your contexts. And so I think there's going to be very many different kinds of factors that come into play. And I think we could go back and forth getting bogged down in the details. And I don't, obviously we don't have time to do that, but I hope you'll have time in discussion to talk through all sorts of very specific kinds of ethical questions. And I think also I wanted to say that if in the course of your thinking after I say anything, if there's a particular worry that you have that you'd like to sort of run by me, please feel free to reach out and talk a little bit. Just send me an email. I'm easy to find. Okay, so what I want to do is share a few ideas with you that come from the entangled empathy approach that Patrice mentioned that I've developed, and think through sort of what's at the core from my point of view of thinking about ethics. And what's at the core of ethics in my way of thinking is perspective taking. Really trying to take perspective, the perspective of another. And in the context of sanctuary work, that's going to be taking the perspective of another animal, but it's also going to be taking the perspective of another person, human person. And it might be people that you know, that we work with on a day-to-day basis. It might be people you don't have that much contact with, say a very important funder, but somebody that you don't know that well, or even people that you don't know at all that you're going to be communicating with, but you want to try to take their perspective. So everything I say is going to be, to some extent, related to how we can best take the perspective of others. And I think one of the things that obviously one wants to do when taking the perspective of another is to try to get the best information you can about that other, what, as Patrice was saying earlier, what their interests might be, and how to figure out what to do about those interests. Now, again, to go back to what I was saying about self-care, the best way to be able to clearly identify interests of another, particularly interests of another that isn't sort of telling you very clearly what that other wants, is to figure out where you are first. Did you get enough sleep? Are you cranky? Are you in a bad mood? Did you have a problem? Did you have a great day? Did something fantastic happen? All of these things are going to shape how it is that you understand what's going on with the other. And so you have to check in with yourself. And part of what I want to just sort of share is that there's a way. I've worked a lot with chimpanzees at chimpanzee sanctuaries, and some fantastic, phenomenal sanctuaries, and some not so fantastic. I wouldn't probably call them sanctuaries. And one of the things that I think is pretty obvious that happens in that context, and I'm sure it happens in all sorts of contexts, is that there's a lot of projection that's going on, that people know exactly what they think this chimpanzee wants because they just know. And I think this idea of projection is something that really we need to be careful about. So one of the reasons I think it's important to check in with yourself to see where you are is so that you're not engaging in a kind of righteous projection of what the other might need or want. Ultimately, perspective taking is about trying to bring about flourishing, to try to help everyone get their interests satisfied. Of course, as Patrice also said, there's going to be competing interests. So it's not going to always be possible to do that. But what one does in this context, and I'm going to get to this in a moment, is try not to discount the interests of the beings that are maybe going to not get what they need. Those interests still matter. Those are what we would call moral remainders. It's a lot easier to think, right, those interests just didn't really matter as much as these other interests. And that's a way of feeling better about your deliberation. I want to suggest that real genuine, meaningful perspective taking allows us to hold on to that loss as well, the interests that aren't met. It doesn't mean that you failed in any way or one fails, but it does mean that some interests weren't met. And that's the reality of our complex interactions in a world of exploitation and violence. So I think that's one of the central topics, perspective taking that I wanted to mention. The other thing I wanted to mention, and this is a somewhat of an odd thought if you're familiar with more traditional views of ethics, I think what's really important in thinking about ethics is, what kind of person do you want to be? I don't think it's a question that we ask as often as we should, not just about how others see you. We're not asking a question about how are others going to see me, but really, how are we going to see ourselves through our actions, through our deliberations? And part of the reason I think this question is so important, what kind of person do I want to be, is because it helps us to ask questions, deeper ethical questions about what our ideals and values are. How do I live up to my ideals? How do I live up to my values? And when I can live up to my ideals and values, then I'm in a better position to extend myself to others. If I'm still trying to sort it out, that's, I think, when a lot of ethical stumbling can happen. So when you take another's perspective, if you're aware of what might be informing you that in that moment, what kind of biases you might have, what kind of mood you're in, and also you're aware of the kind of person you want to be, the values and ideals that you want to instantiate, that you want to bring to your deliberations, I think you're in a really good position to make ethical choices and to make ethical judgments. So what are some of these ideals and values that we might identify in the context of sanctuary work? Well, the obvious one is we want to minimize or prevent suffering and violence. I mean, that's why we're, to a large extent, while we're all involved in this work, is that there's just too much violence and cruelty and suffering in the world. So obviously that's an easy one. That's the kind of ideal and value that we're all engaged in all the time. Another one that I wanted to mention is respect. And it's not just respect for the animals that we're caring for, but respect for each other and respect for our, as I was saying, the people that we may not know who are supporting us. And this is the hardest one, and respecting those who we don't agree with. Obviously that has it can only go so far, but respect, I think, is a crucial value. And I think when we're respectful people, that sort of sets a tone for how these deliberations might go. Another thought, and it's not unrelated, is about integrity. Am I a person that acts according to what I say I'm going to do? If this is the value or ideal that I espouse, this is what I believe, do I act with integrity, or am I willy-nilly? Do I become unreliable? So integrity, I think, is very closely tied to questions of reliability. Can somebody count on you? Is this the kind of thing that when I'm making a decision, people can really trust that I've done my best job in making the right decision, even if there were a lot of good decisions and I made this one and not that one, or there was a lot of bad decisions and I made the least bad decision. So we want to act with integrity. Another really important, at least to me, and I think to many others, ideal and value is justice. And I mean here, this idea that we're not going to engage in the kinds of unjust prejudices that we see in the world around us, that we are committed not just to justice for animals, but to justice simpliciter, justice in all sorts of contexts. And justice for me isn't an abstract notion that one gets at through their capacity to reason or to go before the law or go to the courts or do anything like that. For me, it's really it's integrated with compassion and care and empathy. So justice and care, they're in the ethics world, these are things that are often thought to be at odds, but for me, they're actually really quite connected. You can't really bring about justice if you don't care about those who are the victims of injustice. And you can't really care if you're not doing it in a way that is fair to everybody who's involved in whatever situation you're in. And another value here that I think is centrally important is that, and this is related again to integrity, and that's trustworthiness, and acting with trustworthiness. And this is a trustworthiness that's not just about, for example, the mission that you might have at the sanctuary. It's not just about saying what doing what you say you're going to do, but it's also the kind of thing where people, if something were to go wrong, which it does all the time, people could say, no, these people are trustworthy, so we're not going to jump to any judgmental conclusion here, because these are people who embody the ideal of trustworthiness at this sanctuary. And so if something went astray, I can give you an example, a really sad example. A situation, chimpanzees, again, this is easy for me to use in this context because I don't think there are any chimp sanctuaries, but maybe I'm wrong. But the idea is that chimps are really, they're dangerous wild animals. They interact in ways that can be extremely aggressive towards one another. It's part of their nature in a way, the way they are. They have conflicts and then they come back together to console one another. It's a very sort of natural part of their everyday lives in the wild, and it's something that they do in captivity as well. And when you're introducing chimps to new chimps that are not familiar to them, there can be a tremendous amount of hostility, and there can also be some injuries that occur. And this has created a tremendous amount of tension between chimp sanctuaries about the quote unquote right way to do introductions. But I think that when an introduction goes badly, or when an introduction maybe takes way longer, by which I mean like months and months and months, as opposed to, quarantine introduction, everybody's good, then we just have to go by how trustworthy the people are who are doing it, that they did absolutely intend to do everything in the interests of the chimpanzees, even though there's vast differences in what counts as the right way to do this. So trustworthiness, I think, goes a long way towards mitigating, if you will, some of the conflicts that can emerge when sanctuaries have different procedures and different protocols and different SOPs, right? If it's a trustworthy sanctuary, if you can trust them, then even those differences don't become differences that matter all that much. And the final value or ideal, which I think is so important in thinking about these conflicts, is relationality. Ultimately, our beingness in the world, who we are, is constituted by our relations with others, both near and far. And when we recognize that we're not just constituted by the relationships we're in, but we also constitute those relationships, we shape those relationships, we become very, very clear that we don't want to be in bad relationships. And so that is another way in which I think the value of relationality is so important for doing good ethical work, because we don't want to be in bad relationships. I don't think anybody would endorse being in a bad relationship. Now, of course, there's going to be lots of questions about what is a bad relationship, what isn't a bad relationship, but that's perfectly, that's the perfect grounds for thinking through ethical problems. As long as we're aware that we are in these complex relationships, that we're trying to make better, that we're trying to promote flourishing in our relationships, I think that is super important. So the final thing that I want to say, I know I'm sort of running a bit over time, I think, but the final thing I want to say is about how we can use these values to infuse our practice, both internally and externally. So I think one of the things that Patrice just noted, and I think would be a terrific set of conversations to continue having, is to think about how to instill those values that I was just talking about in communication and in messaging with the larger community, not just within your sanctuaries, not just within your immediate social sphere, in a larger way. And why is that ethically important? Well, I think it's really ethically important because sanctuaries are becoming aspirational sites that tickle or tug at our imaginations for those of us who aren't on the ground day to day doing sanctuary work. sanctuaries are important sites where we can experience and witness multi-species community, friendship, loyalty, and commitment. And these are the kinds of values and ideals that we want, I would think, to just spread throughout the world, not just at the sanctuaries. And so, although it's a heavy burden, I realize, for sanctuaries to carry, especially when there's so much to confront in the world, I think that because sanctuaries occupy this kind of aspirational resistant space, acting ethically amidst that pressure, that is embodying the kind of world that we want to imagine being in, is what sanctuaries can do. They can sort of show us what a world free of hate and free of disrespect and free of injustice and free of callousness and free of vengeance and free of violence looks like. And so ultimately, in social justice work, in transformational work, what we want is models of how it can be. And I think sanctuary, I know I'm not saying, oh, sanctuaries need to model for the rest of the world the ethical way to be, but I do think embodying and communicating the ideals that I just touched on can go a long way in helping the rest of us to shape our own ethics and how to be better with one another, other animals, and the rest of the planet we call home. Okay.
Thank you so much, Lori. And please do, if you had something that you were thinking or wondering, and you might have a question for Lori or a response to something that she said, maybe jot it down for yourself now so that we can come back to it in the Q&A, or as she said, you could reach out to her at another point. I'm going to be mindful of all of our time and move us right on to our next speaker, except that in writing notes about Lori's wonderful talk, I lost my page. Here we go. Elan. Elan is currently a visiting assistant professor of environmental studies at Wesleyan University. Ilan Abrel spent intensive time at numerous sanctuaries while researching his book, Saving Animals, Multi-Species Ecologies of Rescue and Care. Ilan, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here. And I just wanted to say before I started that I loved everything Lori said, but especially that last point is one of the things that I find so personally motivating and inspirational about the sanctuaries and all the hard work you all do. So I just wanted to say thank you, and that I'm deeply grateful to all of you for the work you've done. One of the things that I got to appreciate firsthand from volunteering at sanctuaries for 2 years was what it entails. And so I think you're all heroes in my book. Okay, so as Patrice mentioned at the beginning, I was gonna talk about how I'm sort of starting from this question, how can we make sure that our commitment to animal rights flows into the practice, the practical things that sanctuaries do, the actual practice of sanctuary care. And so one of the many important things I think sanctuaries do is create spaces for unmaking animals as property. And what I mean by that is, so we know that animals, we all know, and a lot of people outside of the sanctuary world know, that animals are living beings with their own interests, emotions, hopes, desires, fears, relationships. But in the external world of the animal industrial complex, to borrow a term coined by Barbara Noske, they're often treated as property or raw resources for human benefit or profit. And obviously not in every context, like many of us probably have companion animals that we relate to outside of sanctuaries, or we know people who do. But in many ways, and I think the exceptions are less common than the norm, and when you factor in just the sheer scale of animals in industrial animal agriculture, for the most part, animals caught up in the human world are treated that way. But in sanctuaries, human caregivers do every day relate to animals as fellow subjects, as individuals, and they work hard to make sure that the animals' needs are met, and their needs and desires both as much as possible are met. Because this is the central goal of sanctuaries, you could even say it's one of the raison d'etres. And so this is one place where I think the question of rights comes in, because if the goal is to care for and respect sanctuary residents as individuals with rights, then it seems important to try to be aware of the kind of contexts that can come up in which it might make anyone more inclined to drop that thread a little bit, or especially some of the moments that Patrice mentioned at the beginning, where it's not even clear that ethics might be playing a role in the decision-making process. And so it's useful to stop and reflect about how the animal's rights can be recentered. So I'm going to use one example because I think it's a complex one. It offers several dimensions to explore, and it's something that a lot of sanctuaries approach differently. But I'm not going to make prescriptions because you all are experts, and I'm not an expert on animal care and sanctuaries, and I don't think it's my place to tell anybody how they should be running their sanctuary. But I do think that that there's a way in which you can approach these things as questions. So I'm going to talk. I'm going to raise some questions in light of this focus that I'm trying to follow on how to center animals' rights. And the example I'm going to use is tours for the public. And I want to put in one caveat too, that all of this is acknowledging from the outset that sanctuaries are perennially strapped for resources and space, and that is a huge context that's going to shape how people approach all the questions that I'm going to raise. So I don't mean to suggest that people can just ignore that reality. So there are obviously important reasons why sanctuaries might offer public tours. There's the vegan advocacy and education about the horrors of animal agriculture. It's an opportunity for people who've never met farmed animals to see them in person and potentially cultivate concern, respect, love, or even empathy, or the kind of entangled empathy that Lori was describing for them. And these things might help people commit to no longer consuming animal products, or actually change the way that they live outside the sanctuary once they're done with the tour. So one of the main risks I see here concerns the focus on, at least as it relates to the focus on following a commitment to animal rights, is that there's the potential of remaking some of that property status by making animals into objects of exhibitionary consumption for visitors who are just there seeking entertainment, and that's why they're there. Another risk is that the animals' rights to autonomy, freedom of association in their own spaces, or a sense of safety in their own homes, because the sanctuary is their home and their community, could be threatened by the presence of unwanted human visitors. And those are just two. There might be other risks we could think of too, but these are two that I think kind of bear on the question of how we make sure that we're centering their rights. And there's obviously a spectrum of approaches to how different sanctuaries deal with the idea of the tour question. And one end of the spectrum could minimize or even erase these risks. The other end would make them highly probable. So on the minimal end, I think there are sanctuaries who are close to the public entirely and don't do tours, or they might do occasional rare tours for certain people who are known and who can be reasonably expected to be respectful to the animals and who are there maybe for like specific reasons outside a regular public tour. And the advocacy part of their mission, sanctuaries that lean this way, they may rely on social media posts or virtual support for people trying to go vegan, like maybe a campaign around Veganuary. On the other end of the spectrum is a situation I think probably a lot of people in our virtual room right now would not even consider a sanctuary. I've heard of places like this, I've never been to one, that have an anti-animal agriculture message or a vegan advocacy mission, but essentially run the sanctuary for the public tours as, charging admission for each visitor, and then they're encouraged to just go in and play with the animals as though it's like a petting zoo, which is not, like I said, again, on all the sanctuaries I've ever visited and all the tours I've been on, not something I've seen firsthand. And then there's a lot of approaches that I think fall somewhere along that spectrum, more towards the minimizing end of things. But for those ones that are engaging in tours or making the decision to do tours, but want to do them in a manner that still carries through on the commitment to animal rights. I'm going to raise some questions that I think are, again, I'm not suggesting answers, but I think questions that are worth considering in approaching that. So one is, can animals opt out of being ambassadors? In other words, is it possible for them to avoid the tours if they want to? Do they have places to go where visitors can't? Can they choose not to be seen, especially if human surveillance causes them stress? And can they do that without having to hide or cower in a small space? Is their space designed in such a way, is the space where they live, the sanctuary space, designed in such a way that it facilitates tours, but curtails the freedom of movement in some way for the animals? So sanctuaries obviously have to make decisions about animal safety, which may or may not include separating different sanctuary animals from each other who might in some way pose a risk of harm. But so that obviously sometimes requires fences and other kinds of architecture to do that. But are the spaces also being divided up by fences or structures in ways that are to make the tour, to make it safe for tours, to make it safe for the human visitors who are coming in from the outside? I do remember going to the CARE conference that Farm Sanctuary put on and hearing several years ago, and hearing some funny stories about goats who didn't have much patience for little children. I mean, nobody got hurt, but like you can imagine that it could lead to that. So sometimes maybe there's a danger. So is the space being done in a way that it's to protect humans, or is there a way of doing it such that the humans are safe, but it's not infringing on animals' freedom of moving through their own space? On the other hand, can animals who want to meet or interact with new humans approach them safely? And so I'm thinking of, are the tour members arguably adequately informed about how to respect and interact with the animals that do wish to come and say hi? I'm sure everybody's got some really outgoing, fun friends who like to say hi to everybody. My dog is one of those people. She's so much more excited to see the UPS person than me. And then I was going to raise some more abstract concerns. So is the tour, this is kind of like a general question to ask about the decision of how to do the tour and whether to do the tour. Is the tour worth it, or is it accomplishing its intended purpose? So who is actually coming on the tours? Is it families looking for a way to entertain the kids for a couple hours? Is it vegans from the city coming to see animals and try to, emotionally recharge from their AR work? And it's not, I'm not trying to suggest that in either of those scenarios necessarily wouldn't lead to furthering the advocacy mission. They obviously both could. The families could decide to go vegan. The vegans who are already vegan might find this as a way to like maintain their vegan practice, not fall off the wagon. But these questions about what the impact on the groups who are coming are, I think, could help guide reflection about how the tours are going in practice versus the ideal sort of measure. Like, are they paying off for what they're trying to accomplish? And then one more question about the impact of tours on the members of the public is, how does the setting of the sanctuary affect the way they might respond to the tours? And this goes back a little bit to what Patrice was saying in the beginning about decisions around design of space and sort of the infrastructure. So is there a risk that instead of getting the intended message about the harms of animal agriculture and the reason why it should end, that visitors might see the happy farm animals they're engaging with in a potentially farm-like setting and think, oh, this is basically what the animals who are raised by the farmer's market meat and cheesemonger that I see on Sundays. This is how their animals live too. I'm just seeing like what a happy farm looks like. And if that is a risk, then how can it be addressed throughout the tour to emphasize that this is not what you might imagine the children's books and the farmer's market cheesemonger want to tell you their animals are doing, but actually quite different. So to wrap up, I'll reiterate that I'm not trying to make any prescriptions about how to approach the decision of whether to do tours or how to do tours. But I hope that these questions have been useful in both highlighting specific things worth considering in the context of tours, and at a more general level, pointing towards how we can, in a range of different contexts, reflect on the practices in sanctuaries to ensure that they're best being followed in a way that can respect animals' rights and carry through that commitment to animals' rights rather than dropping the thread. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ilan. Very thought-provoking. So I'm not going, I guess I have to introduce myself because I'm the next speaker. I am Patrice Jones. I'm not even sure if I remembered to say that at the beginning of the session, but I am Patrice Jones, one of the co-founders of Vine Sanctuary, which is an LGBTQ-led farmed animal sanctuary in Springfield, Vermont, that works for social and environmental justice, as well as for animal liberation. More than 700 animals live at the sanctuary, which celebrated its 20th anniversary in 2020. 20th anniversary in 2020. So that's what I usually say to introduce myself. One thing about Vine that doesn't get talked about as much, or that because we don't talk about it as much, is that we were founded not only by LGBTQ people, but by people with disabilities. And a significant number of our staff and volunteers are people with disabilities. So I thought that I would begin and mostly talk about two concepts from disability rights. And those are presumption of competence and privilege of risk. And all of this is because the title of my talk is supposedly, I think, Confronting Our Own Speciesism. Okay, so people with disabilities have experienced and continue to experience and endure many of the same injuries experienced by animals. Perpetual incarceration, forced sterilization, made to work without compensation, being treated as perpetual juveniles, being put on display, being seen as dumb or uncommunicative simply because they communicate in different ways. Being seen as less than due to a lack or presumed lack, often erroneously presumed lack, of one or another ability. And so the idea underlying that the last two, is this idea that difference is lack, and that lack is inferiority. And that's ableism. The idea that having certain capabilities makes you more worthy of moral concern, makes you inherently superior. And ableism is a key component of speciesism. Now, I'm just going to use the words, people use different definitions for things like speciesism. Just for now, I'm using the word speciesism just as my shorthand for the habits of belief and behavior that excuse and enact human supremacy. And what I want to make clear, as uncomfortable as it is to confront, is that just because we decide that we're going to be vegan or rescue animals or support animal rights doesn't mean that we have magically divested ourselves of speciesism and of our presumptions of human superiority. That, you know, those presumptions have just disappeared. And I believe that for those of us who do hands-on work with non-human animals, or who help to make decisions about the lives of animals in captivity, including in captivity at sanctuaries, it's essential to be conscious and rigorous about actually actively challenging our speciesism, actually challenging our presumptions of human superiority. in 20 some years of doing sanctuary work myself and visiting other sanctuaries, consulting for other sanctuaries, one of the most common ways that I've seen speciesism in action has been in ethical decision-making about questions such as freedom versus safety. Putting it as, well, I'm going to be direct. I'm trying not to be unkind, but I have seen sanctuary folks treat adult animals like incompetent juveniles who couldn't possibly know better than humans how to make choices about their own lives. And people with disabilities know what it's like to be treated that way. And that's why they came up with, oh, I guess I should say we, because I'm part of the disability rights movement too, but I didn't, these ideas weren't my brainstorm. So this is why people in the disability rights movement came up with these two really important principles. And first is the presumption of competence. What that is that you presume that an adult is competent to make their own decisions. Unless you have evidence otherwise. Oftentimes we treat animals the opposite, like we demand proof of competence and assume incompetence. And I'm saying adults, but of course, you know, there's a range, just as there is with humans. Teenagers among humans are somewhat more capable of making their own decisions, but their frontal cortex hasn't completely finished growing, so they're not quite as competent at that, at things like risk assessment as adults are, for example. So the presumption of competence just says you presume competence unless you've got some evidence otherwise. And you do this as a matter of dignity. So the what and the why are pretty easy, but the how can be the hard part, especially in a sanctuary setting. So I have a few ideas about ways that we can make sure that we are honoring the presumption of competence, that we are in fact presuming that adults who are both in our care and held captive by us, however much we might not like to think about it that way, are presumed to be competent and not interfered with on the basis of a presumption of an unfair presumption of incompetence. So the first thing I think that can be really useful is thinking about language, the language that you use to talk among yourselves at the sanctuary, or we use to talk among ourselves at the sanctuary, and also the language we use when we're talking about non-human community members. So often I hear people refer to adult animals as babies, as boys or girls. I don't know how many times I've heard hens rescued from egg factories who are fully adult referred to as girls. I think that that verbal tick is meaningful and is going to steer you toward presumptions of incompetence rather than presumptions of competence. Similarly, sometimes I hear people talk about our animals as if they were our property, even though we know that we're not thinking of non-human animals as property. And so you have to sort of, at Vine, what we'll do, we'll stop and say non-human community members, or the bovine members of our community, or the birds at our community. And so we refer to it as a community that includes us and includes the non-human animals. And that gets us away from having to say our animals, which again can lead to that presumption of incompetence. So that's one thing. Also, I think just any way that you can find to talk about the dignity and adulthood of adult animals at the sanctuary, to talk about elders as elders and to recognize the roles that they play in flocks and herds. Talking about that among yourselves, talking about that on social media, that can help too. Inside yourself, this sort of leads to inside yourself. You can also like think about relative ages. I do this all the time. Like I try and figure out like if this cow is an adolescent, that's one thing. But actually, this other cow is the equivalent of my peer or even my elder based on their age. Within what their age range is, if that makes sense. And I remind myself, you know, this is my elder, or this is my peer, or this is a teenager, or this is a juvenile. I mean, you've got to treat juveniles appropriately as well. So I'm not talking about treating juveniles as if they were adults. I'm just talking about making sure you're mindful of adultness. Another thing that can be really useful is reminding yourself of all the things you don't know. Really regularly, and reminding yourself, and this can sort of play into, I think what Lori was saying, and Elan was saying about how sanctuaries can provoke the people who are looking in to think differently. Remind yourself of all the things that animals know that you don't know, and talk about those as well. The things that were like coming to my mind is I was especially thinking about when I first started a sanctuary, and you know, you could watch a chicken and it looks like she's just pecking the dirt, but in fact what's happening is that she's able to see minerals that your eyes can't even see and know which ones are good for her. That's amazing. Or you see ducks dibbling in a mud puddle, and it looks like what are they doing? But if you know that actually they are sieving, and then they have these complicated sense orders that allow them to figure out like which are the nutrients, and to take in the nutrients and then to spit back out the stuff that's not nutrients. You couldn't do that with puddle water. So just like making a conscious effort to just remind yourself of all the stuff you don't know and all the stuff that animals do know that you don't know, can incline you more towards a presumption of competence rather than a presumption of incompetence. Oh, and then most importantly, require yourself to explain and justify every time you substitute your judgment for that of an adult animal. That's what I do. I make, if I'm going to substitute my judgment for the judgment of another adult, I better have a good reason for doing that, other than just I'm bigger and stronger and have thumbs. And for me, at least, everybody's going to come down differently on this. For me, the two reasons that I feel okay about substituting my judgment for the judgment of a competent adult is if I know something they don't know and they couldn't possibly know. And I know, and I have a pretty good idea that if they knew that thing that I know that they don't know, they would want me to do X or Y. Like I'm thinking about this cow called Ebony, who escaped from a slaughterhouse or a dairy, lived on her own for months with a calf who she took care of and protected. I'm talking about literally months in the forest, keeping herself alive and her calf alive, and then being smart enough to seize a safe place when she saw it, and trust a safe person when she was being literally chased by unsafe people. This is a competent person. This is a person with more survival sense than I have, I think. Nonetheless, she doesn't understand about antibiotics, and couldn't possibly. And so if she were, knock wood, let's hope not, to have pneumonia, I would feel okay about giving her an injection of penicillin, even if she really didn't want that shot, because I know she wants to live, and I know she can't possibly understand microbes, or that this shot is going to help her. So that would be an example of a time that I would feel comfortable. And then, of course, sometimes you do need to overrule in order to protect others. That would be the other one for me. So for me, it's if I need to protect somebody else from some harmful behavior, or if I am in possession of knowledge that that person doesn't know, couldn't possibly know. And I think that if they knew it, this is what they would want me to do. So next, and even harder, is the privilege of risk. That's within disability rights, it's simply a matter of saying, look, as adults, we have the right to take risks, just like everybody else. I know that cows at the sanctuary are like super caring people, but I really would not like it if they were to use their superior strength and size to prevent me from ever leaving the grounds of the sanctuary because they knew that there are murderers among the humans and they want to protect me from them. I would not feel okay with that. And so as a matter of dignity, adults get the right to decide what risks they're going to take. So that's the what and the why. And again, the how is even harder. And I'm not just talking about calculating probabilities of risk, but it's really hard because you feel like it's your job to protect somebody from every possible risk. Look, ask any, even before we even talk about sanctuary, ask any parent of a young adult how hard it is to let somebody go off to college and make decisions or about themselves. And our feeling of of a responsibility can lead us, I think, and I have seen this at sanctuaries. I have seen situations where there's so much exaggerated fear of, any possible risk of predation that the lives of animals are really so sharply constrained. And it sometimes seems to me that this is mostly a way for the people to make sure they feel like they've done every possible thing, and not really thought about what's the actual risk here, and how much do people want, how much do birds want to be in trees, for example. This brings me to the emotional piece of it, because it's hard to recognize yourself as both a carer and a captor. That's what we are. We can't help but being that. Nobody at a sanctuary is free, unless some of us do some rewilding. We do here. So there have been rewilded ducks and rewilded pigeons. But for the most part, the cows, the goats, they're not free to just leave and not come back. And it's not that you want to be their captor. It's the property relations in which we're all ensnared that forces you to be their captor as well as their carer. But if we think about, if we use our empathy, then we recognize, I always feel uncomfortable when people portray animals at sanctuaries as having no feelings but gratitude towards the humans, because I feel it's probably a lot more mixed than that, and so I think probably many sanctuary residents have a really complicated mix of feelings about the humans, and one thing that I find as a useful ethical exercise is to really challenge myself to quite specifically imagine and respond to what that whole range of feelings might be. Finally, because this has been deep and maybe not pleasant to think about sometimes, I want to raise a more joyful precept from, well, I think these precepts are joyful, but another precept from disability rights, and that's interdependence. So people with disabilities are often presumed to be lesser because they need things. There's this this cultural belief that, you know, dependent equals lesser. And that can factor its way into sanctuary thinking as well. Here we have animals who are dependent on us for everything. And so if you have this tendency to think of independent as good and dependent as bad, that can be a problematic way of thinking that inflects, unconsciously inflects how you think about and treat the animals in your care. But the concept of interdependence, which is no, it's not just that like some people are dependent and others aren't. Like everybody is dependent and we're all interdependent in a multiplicity of ways. This is a way of thinking that not only contradicts the idea that dependent equals lesser, but it reminds us of our dependence on the larger than human world. And so it knocks us down off that human supremacy pedestal, because actually we can't live without the algae and the trees making the oxygen, right? And so this idea of interdependence opens up the possibility to see sanctuary as not something that humans set up for animals, but as a mutually constituted community in which humans and animals together figure out how to have better relationships within current realities, as hard as they are.